Ever wonder why that shiny imported gadget costs a bit more than you expected? It might be because of something called a tariff. Yes, tariff, not a fancy French dessert, but essentially a tax on imported goods. Sounds dull? Stick around, we're going to talk about them like they're cool. Tariffs have ignited international feuds, funded governments, tanked economies, and even inspired a famous scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. In plain terms, a tariff is a tax on goods when they cross a national border, usually a tax on imports. Imagine a border officer saying, "Welcome in, that'll be 25% extra please," to your imported cheese. The importing company pays this fee to the government at the port of entry, often adding the cost to the product's price tag. So, you, the consumer, ultimately pay more. In other words, a tariff is like a cover charge for foreign products at Club United States. Want to sell your stuff in our country? Pay the entry fee. Why do countries do this? Typically for one of three reasons. What one economist dubbed the 3 R's of tariffs: revenue, restriction, and reciprocity. First, tariffs raise revenue for the government. Easy money. Second, they restrict imports, giving a price advantage to domestic products. Home team gets a boost. Third, they can be tools of reciprocity, as in, if you tax my goods, I'll tax yours, to pressure other countries to lower their trade barriers. It's economics meets political posturing. Despite what some tweets may claim, tariffs are not paid by foreign countries out of the goodness of their hearts. They're paid by importers, usually domestic companies, and passed to consumers, reflected in higher prices. So when a certain leader said, "Trade wars are good and easy to win," many economists collectively facepalmed. Tariffs have been around longer than sarcasm. Well, almost. In the early United States, tariffs were the main source of federal revenue. No income tax back then, so Uncle Sam funded himself by taxing imports. In fact, before the Civil War, tariffs accounted for about 90% of US government revenue. Talk about a reliable cash cow. American statesmen like Alexander Hamilton championed tariffs to protect budding US industries, figuring it would help the young nation stand on its own. It worked, albeit at the cost of making imported goods pricier. By 1828, Congress passed a famously high tariff, up to 50% on some goods, that critics in the South angrily nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations. If people call your policy an abomination, you know they're not thrilled. This North-South tariff feud over who wins or loses from trade was one of many economic tensions in the lead-up to the Civil War. Fast forward to 1930. The U.S. is in the Great Depression after the 1929 crash, and along come Senator Reed Smoot and Rep. Willis Hawley with a bold idea: raise tariffs sky-high to protect American jobs. The result was the notorious Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which hiked tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. How high? It raised the average tariff level by about 20%, on top of already steep tariffs. In theory, making foreign goods pricier would force Americans to buy American-made products, boosting local factories. Over 1,000 economists begged President Hoover to veto this tariff bomb, but politics won out, and Hoover signed it anyway. The outcome? Let's just say it's a permanent fixture in the Bad Ideas in Economics Hall of Fame. U.S. trading partners retaliated with tariffs of their own. International trade collapsed. U.S. imports from and exports to Europe plunged dramatically, and the Great Depression got even worse. Smoot-Hawley became the ultimate cautionary tale. Even decades later, politicians invoke it as a warning. We don't want another Smoot-Hawley. When your tariff gets its own infamous pop culture reference, you know it's bad. The catastrophe of the 1930s brought a plot twist. Tariffs went out of style. In 1934, the U.S. shifted course with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, giving the president authority to cut deals to lower tariffs with other countries. After World War II, this idea blossomed globally. The U.S. and other nations, remembering how trade barriers worsened the Depression, set up systems to avoid tariff wars. They formed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, all aimed at gradually reducing tariffs worldwide to spur trade and economic growth. In short, from the 1940s onward, the world largely agreed that lower tariffs equals good, trade wars equals bad. Tariff rates that once routinely sat in the double digits dwindled to low single digits in many countries. Free trade was the trend, at least until recently. Cue the dramatic music. Tariffs are back in the headlines in the 21st century. In the past few years, we've witnessed the rise of new trade tensions and what media dub the trade war, especially between the US and China. It started in earnest around 2018, when the US government decided that decades of cheap imports needed a rebalancing. The US slapped tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, citing national security and protection of metal industries. Not long after, it launched a barrage of tariffs on Chinese goods, complaining about unfair trade practices. By 2019, the US had placed tariffs, ranging mostly from 10% to 25%, on roughly $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, spanning electronics, appliances, furniture, you name it. China hit back with tariffs on about $110 billion of US goods, which, fun fact, is nearly everything China buys from America. They literally couldn't tariff much more unless they started taxing Boeing jets and soybeans twice. Suddenly, the world's two biggest economies were locked in a tit-for-tat tariff fight. One side loudly insisted it would force the other to bend. The other side insisted it wouldn't back down. Sound like a schoolyard fight? It kind of was, except with spreadsheets and supply chains instead of fists. Other countries got caught in the crossfire or waged mini-tariff spats of their own. The US didn't exempt friends. Allies like the European Union, Canada, and Mexico were hit with steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018, prompting them to retaliate. The EU, for instance, struck back by targeting iconic American products. Motorcycles, peanut butter, orange juice, jeans, and bourbon whiskey all got a 25% import tax in Europe. Why these items? Because they're high-profile and politically sensitive exports from the US. A clever way to make American businesses scream and therefore pressure US leaders to reconsider. Nothing says "I mean business" like making a classic American bourbon more expensive overseas. Trade policy can be petty. You tax my steel? Fine, I'll tax your Harley-Davidson bikes and Kentucky bourbon. It's a bit like world leaders playing economic dodgeball with each other's favorite toys. Meanwhile, back in the US, policymakers touted tariffs as a way to bring back manufacturing jobs and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. There's some evidence it helped certain industries, like domestic steel saw prices and production go up initially. But tariffs also had side effects, some intended, many not. Other nations don't just sit quietly. They punch back with their own tariffs or buy from someone else. American soybean farmers, for example, lost billions in sales when China stopped buying from the US and sourced soybeans from Brazil instead. US exporters suddenly found their products unwelcome or pricier abroad, hurting their sales. The US government ended up spending over $28 billion in 2018-2019 to bail out farmers who were collateral damage of the trade war. That's right, tariff revenue was basically recycled to soothe those hurt by foreign retaliation, trade war judo at its finest. Oh, and remember how tariffs were supposed to be a tax on foreigners? In reality, American companies and consumers bore most of the costs. By 2019, economists estimated the US-China tariffs were costing the typical US household about $419 a year, just from higher prices and lost economic efficiency. When tariffs on a broader range of goods kicked in, that cost rose to around $831 per household per year. Think of it as an invisible surcharge at the store. Suddenly that cheap imported TV or sneaker isn't so cheap. Even American manufacturers felt the squeeze. Companies that rely on imported parts, a huge part of modern supply chains, saw their costs jump, forcing them to raise prices or cut other costs. Tariffs might sound abstract, but they ripple through the economy. Here are a few key areas and how tariffs have made an impact. Electronics and tech. A lot of our gadgets are made abroad or use foreign-made components. Recent US tariffs on Chinese tech imports meant higher costs for electronics. For example, many smartphones, laptops, and TVs faced extra import taxes. Companies either swallow the cost, hurting their profit, or pass it to consumers. In the trade war, some firms tried to move production to countries like Vietnam to dodge tariffs, but that's not always easy or cheap. The result? You pay a bit more for that phone upgrade. So if your next gaming console feels pricier, you can partly thank tariff policies adding a few extra dollars to its cost. Agriculture. Farms got caught in the crossfire of international retaliation. When the US put tariffs on China, China retaliated by taxing US agricultural exports, hitting soybeans, corn, pork, and more. Losing the huge Chinese market drove US crop prices down and left many American farmers with surplus harvests and shrinking income. The impact was so severe that the US government issued emergency aid to farmers to keep them afloat. Basically, taxpayers footed the bill to compensate for the lost foreign sales. So if you noticed headlines about farm bailout, that was a tariff side effect. Everyday consumer goods. Tariffs have quietly raised prices on many day-to-day items. One striking example. In 2018, the US put tariffs of 20% to 50% on imported washing machines to protect domestic appliance makers. What happened? The price of washing machines shot up significantly, and dryers, which weren't even tariffed, went up similarly because retailers typically sell washers and dryers together. Consumers paid an extra $1.5 billion or so for laundry appliances, which put a notable dent in household budgets. Yes, you read that right. Every time you shop for new appliances, there's a hidden tariff waiting in the bill. Tariffs may not be the most thrilling topic at a dinner party, but they pack a real punch in the real world. They're essentially a tool, sometimes used to shield local industries or pressure trade partners, and other times used as political theater to show toughness. Historically, they've been heroes, funding young America, protecting fledgling industries, and villains, Smoot-Hawley's global debacle. Today, they're a bit of both, loved by some industries and politicians, loathed by others and most economists. So, what's the takeaway for the average person? Tariffs can affect you, from the cost of your groceries and gadgets to the health of your job market. They can save certain jobs, but also make many products more expensive and even cost other jobs. It's a high-stakes balancing act. One moment, a tariff might be protecting a steelworker in Indiana. The next, it's making a car a few $100s pricier for a family in Nevada. As consumers, we often pay quietly in the form of higher prices due to tariffs, even as the political debates rage on about whether tariffs are good or bad. In a world where globalization has tied economies closely together, tariffs are like the speed bumps on the highway of trade. Hit too many, and the ride gets bumpy, and your coffee might spill. Recent years have shown that trade wars, despite the optimistic slogan that they're easy to win, often end up with both sides feeling some pain. It turns out that when each country raises prices on the other's goods, consumers on both sides lose buying power, and a lot of effort goes into finding workarounds or providing subsidies. Yet, tariffs aren't going away. They remain a powerful, if blunt, instrument of policy. World leaders will continue to brandish them in negotiations, and industries will continue lobbying for tariff protection when times get tough. For better or worse, tariffs are the drama kings of trade policy, turning otherwise dry economic policy into front-page news and international shouting matches. The next time you're shopping and balking at the price of an imported item, You can humor yourself with the thought, "Ha, must be a tariff." Then impress your friends by explaining it. Now you're armed with the knowledge of what tariffs are, why countries use them, and how they trace a line from the Boston Tea Party era to your latest Amazon purchase. Tariffs. They put the tax in taxing my patience, but at least now you're in on the joke. If you found this video informative or remotely entertaining, do us a favor and hit that like button. It's tariff-free, we promise, and subscribe and share. It really goes a long way to allowing us to produce informative and engaging content. No matter what the prices are in the grocery store, just remember, when you feed on facts, you'll never go hungry.